And since Kasparov is threatening to play knight to d5 so that he can target this queen, so to stop this, here Yuri played e6, covering this d5 square. Okay, so now black must consider developing this bishop to e7 so that he can defend this knight if white captured this knight. But instead he goes for b6, and after that he simply captured this knight, and after takes you can see that now black pawn structure get compromised. And after that, here Kasparov pushed this pawn to f5, trying to rip off these pawn structure. Here Kasparov is preparing for queen to h4 so that he can target this h7 pawn. But here black decides to bring his knight to e5, and here suppose if instead of knight to e5 he goes for h6, then that will be a big mistake, because then in this position white can actually sacrifice his rook by rook takes h6, because if bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, and you can see now in the next move, now this king is completely exposed, and in the next move white will bring this rook to f1, and then f3, and then this place which is g3, and this will smash the black king. And suppose to defend this, if black decides to bring his knight to e7, then rook to f1, black will go according to his plan. After takes, rook to f3, and finally knight to g6. And most of you will be like, bro, this threat is now gone, but you are wrong, because black can bring his rook to h3 so that he can mate from this h7 square, and if rook at f goes to e8, creating some space for this king, but simply e takes f5, and you can see now this knight is under attack, and this is completely winning position for white. So that's why after seeing this all complications, after queen to f4 he decides to go for knight to e5, and now if Garry goes for queen to h4, then black can easily push this move which is h6, and you can see by this there is no more threats. and that's an inaccuracy by black. Instead, he must consider this move d5, trying to open up the center. This is because after takes, bishop takes d5, and if white captured this bishop by knight takes d5, simply rook takes d5, asking for rook exchange, and after takes, queen takes b6 and knight to c4, attacking this queen as well as creating a discover attack on this bishop. And if white captured this knight, simply after takes, this knight is now under attack, so he has to move. Suppose he goes to d2, simply queen to e2, which attacks this knight again, and and also this pawn on c2. And you can see by this, black queens get more active, attacking this and this. Okay, so in the actual game, after queen to c7, and now it's better for white to bring this rook to g3 so that he can take control over this g file and also pins this bishop. But instead he goes for bishop to c4. He wants to keep an eye on this diagonal, but Yuri immediately goes for d5, attacking this bishop. And now this knight on d4 is very important because it's controlling the center. So he should bring this c knight to e2, but instead he made a small inaccuracy by placing this knight on e2. And since the d4 square is now opened, so black can bring his bishop to f8 so that he can later bring this bishop to c5, which targets this king and this queen. But instead he goes for b5. And after that, he brings his rook to f3 so that he can guard this f5 pawn. And now it's better to push b4 so that he can target this knight, but instead Yuri brings back his knight to c4. As you can see, here black wants to go to this even square, and the best way to tackle this is simply sliding this king to g2 and then f3. By this, you can see that there is no more attack, but instead he brings back his knight to f4, and that's an inaccuracy because now this knight on f4 is not doing too much here. Whereas before on f5 it kept an eye on this g7 and f6 square. And since this g7 square is now undefended, so black brings his bishop to g7, and here white cannot capture this pawn on d5 by knight at f takes d5. This is because now black can play this amazing move queen to c5, pinning this rook, and now he can capture this knight on d5 later. And suppose if white unpins the king by sliding his king to g3, now black can create more pressure by playing rook to d8, and you can see now no one can protect this knight. And if white tries to place any cheap tricks like knight to a4 which attacks this queen, but simply queen to a7, and you can see now this knight on d5 is gone in the next move. Okay, so in the actual game, after bishop to g7, and now black is threatening to pin this rook and this king. So to defend this, here he brings his king further to g3. Now black has option to pin this knight by bishop to g4, but instead he goes for rook to d8. Now it's better for white to go for rook to f1 and then rook to b1, which attacks this queen and this bishop. But instead he goes for king to h4. And you can see now this rook is under attack, but in this position Kasparov sacrificed this rook by playing knight to f4. And in the next move, white will bring this knight to h5, which targets these weak square of black pawn. And now it's better to bring this rook to a6 with the idea of queen to b6, asking for queen exchange. And if knight to b5, he tries to protect this queen, simply queen to b6, takes, takes, knight to d4, and clearly this is a winning position for black. But after knight to h5, he goes for rook to e8, and now white can attack this rook by knight to b5, but he goes for g5, which weakens the f5 pawn, and black can simply attack this by bishop to c8. But again he missed that and captured on h5. And obviously you cannot capture this rook due to this threat of queen to g7 mate. And in the next move he is also preparing for queen to h4 so that he can give a discover check. So to tackle this, here he brings his rook to g8, asking for rook exchange, and it's better for white to go according to his plan, which is queen to h4, so that he can bring this knight to this f6 square. But instead he decides to exchange the rooks. And that's a big blunder by Yuri. But why this is a blunder, we will see this later. But for now, instead he must consider this move, which is rook to a6, because if white gives a check, suppose from g4, king to f8, and knight to d4, threatening to give a check from g7 square, as well as preparing for this knight sacrifice. Why this knight sacrifice, we will also see this later. But for now, suppose if queen to e7, creating an escaping square, and if white gives a check, we can simply slide this to e8, queen to g8 check, king to d7, and you can see now there is no more threats. And if he attacks our bishop by queen to b8, simply we can play bishop to c6. And in the next move, black is also threatening to give a check from e3 square so that he can grab this rook. Okay, so in the actual game, after rook to c6, and in this position, Kasparov sacrificed his knight by knight to e6 check. And obviously you cannot capture this with the f pawn. Suppose if f takes e6, then queen to g7 check, king to e8, knight takes f6 check, and you can see now this king cannot go anywhere, so black has to lose his queen, and at the end, yeah, that's all. Okay, so that's why after this move knight to e6 check, he decides to grab this by his rook. And now in this position, white must consider this amazing move queen to f4 so that he can give a check from g7 square and cover these important squares so that this king can't enter. And suppose if game continues like king takes e6, knight to g7 check, king to d7, and finally knight to f5 so that he can give a check from d6 square. And you can see that by this neither side can make any progress, and this game will be equal. Okay, so but in the actual game, after king to e7, he made an mistake by playing queen to g7. And that's a huge blunder by Kasparov. Instead, he must consider this amazing move knight to e2 so that he can give a check from g3 square, and suppose if queen to a5 so that he can give a check, so that he can place this queen to this e1 and grab this knight. Then we can go for queen to g3 check. If king to e6, queen to b8, and you can see white is threatening to capture this bishop, but it can be easily defended. So by this this game will be completely equal. But after this move king to g3, here Yuri brings his queen to a5. He wants to give a check from e1 square. So to stop this, he brings his king to f2. And in this position, Garry Kasparov resigned, because suppose after king to h3, then black can give a check again from f5, king to h4, queen takes f4 check, king to h3, queen to e3 check, king to g4, queen to g5 check, king to h3, and finally bishop to g2 checkmate. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.